I just want to say one thing to start, and that is the kinds of things we study at the BGC. All of us study such different things here at the BGC. There's such a range of areas, but I think the question really is utilitarian objects, decorative arts, material culture, rather than paintings and sculpture exclusively. So I've always been interested in that. I think when I started studying art history, I came to it already knowing that my interests were not going to be traditional brush strokes and attribution of painters and things like that. I was interested in the context and the cultural history. And as an undergraduate, I got involved in a program called European Cultural Studies at Princeton, which was one of the first university programs to really deal with this larger context of cultural history. And so the classes that I took for that concentration were between departments. There was, a professor from literature paired up with a history professor, and a professor from art history paired up with a literature professor. And that's, I think, the closest thing to what we do here at the BGC. So that was really good training. And then I did do art history in graduate school because I wanted to make sure that I could stay close to objects and work with things rather than just documents and ideas, although obviously I worked a lot on documents and ideas also in the course of my research and my teaching. But I think basically it is about linking up objects with the makers and the consumers and the long history of things and how they age and move through time, and the social life of things. That's a phrase that we throw around here a lot. The intellectual history of the material world, that's another phrase that you'll hear a lot at the BGC. And I think these are all really areas that I've been pursuing since I began studying. So my own work has been always on the more documentary side of art history. My doctoral dissertation was about a small town in Tuscany and all of the works of art that were commissioned by the town government. So I did a lot of archival work for that and probably spent more time looking at papers than at the objects. And when I eventually finished my PhD, I worked at the Met for a few years, and obviously there I was teaching and lecturing a lot in the galleries, and that gave me an opportunity to focus on objects kind of in the other direction than what I'd done on my dissertation. And by the time I got to the BGC, I think I was kind of in the perfect place between the more traditional study of art history and a more radical contextual study of objects. So the book that was published a couple months ago is called Food and Knowledge in Renaissance Italy, Bartolomeo Scappi's Paper Kitchens. And it is a study from many perspectives of the first illustrated cookbook. I got interested in this particular cookbook because I started teaching classes here about, what I thought at the time were table decorations and objects and dishes and things that were used in food preparation and service, including pots and pans, more utilitarian things. But in order to access these, I thought of looking at cookbooks and recipes to see what sorts of things were mentioned just incidentally in the description of how to make a particular dish. And so I started reading these cookbooks and got completely fascinated by the kinds of information and the way they were organized and the whole sort of history of the book angle of the cookbooks. And this whole topic kind of mushroomed. And I, over the course of really a few years of teaching, a few kind of iterations of this course as it evolved with my students, I got completely fascinated by this one book because of the illustrations, because they were really, really unique in all the other up to that point. This was published in the middle of the sort of second half of the 16th century, and up to that point, there were recipe books, there were lots of manuscript collections, and then ultimately they went into print around 1500, like so many other kinds of texts. And so this project really came out of my teaching, but out of an interest in contextualizing so many of the objects that we see on display in museum collections that were once on the table, used for food preparation, part of dining rituals, part of celebrations including food, and yet there was almost no information anywhere on a label that told you anything about that context. So it really came out of that pretty simple question. And over the years, I think there has been more and more interest in food history and food studies, because obviously food is such an essential part of our culture and really part of any culture. And all of us spend probably more time than we care to admit thinking about food, planning our food, and thinking about it afterwards. So it seemed to me a really good way to kind of get into this whole subject and make a bridge between a historical reality and something that's very familiar. And of course, as historians, we don't necessarily always want to make everything, relevant to our students, but it helps when there's some kind of continuity or connection to the past that makes it seem more meaningful for all of us. When I was working on the cookbook project, I got really interested in pictures of workers in treatises, architectural treatises, and mining treatises, and mechanical treatises. And I got really interested in there's a kind of style of the way people who are kind of lowly workers are represented in early modern in art. And I am interested in looking at that and tracing it up, sort of through the 18th century, looking at pictures of people doing jobs, the ubiquitous presence of servants and helpers and pages and courtiers and all these things. Another area that I'm very engaged with professionally and also in teaching is the museum, the world of the museum. And as the coordinator for history and theory of museums at BGC, I supervise and sort of think about our curriculum and as it relates to the museum world, which so many of our students really are interested in working in museums. We don't teach really practical courses here, although we do offer lots of opportunities to work in the gallery, to learn sort of hands-on different aspects of working in a museum and a gallery. But I'm interested in how art historians and people who are training to work in a museum acquire that knowledge and what sorts of things are useful to know, and to think about museums as really kind of social and political entities, as well as places that are custodians of art. Having worked in a museum in education for several years, I feel like I have a certain perspective on museums in a somewhat academic sense, not just as a curator. So that, I think, helps me to bridge the two worlds that are, in a sense, still somewhat distinct. When you're working there, you don't really have perspective, whereas when you come away and can look sort of critically at the whole history of the museum in terms of the development of national museums and local museums and what all these other aspects that go into people's interest in museums and to the history of collecting, I think it's very valuable.